So he basically said, "I'm a young musician. I'm trying to make a living here," and I think it was implicit. I don't think he had to be so explicit about it. But I could go to another company and that might try to sell my records. And if you're not going to try to help sell it, then what good are you? And that same kind of question applies today, especially with the rise of the internet and the possibility of digital downloads and direct marketing. I think every record company in America has to ask themselves, what are you doing for the artists that they can't do for themselves?
Yeah, why should anybody go buy this artifact?
Right.
Like that?
Yeah, even if it weren't digital, Ida DeFranco has shown that an artist can set up her own label, and she looks for regular distribution and all that type of stuff, but she can do it herself, and she's very successful at it. Does she really need a record company? Would she be selling twice as many? Otherwise, if she had a record company, I don't think so. I suspect she probably sells more than if she had a record company.
I suspect that takes an unusual amount of energy, drive, and
and
probably an extraordinary
and
person.
there's only a limited number of people that can do that, I think. I think she probably sells more because of that, but that's a shtick. Every artist can't have the same shtick because then it's not novel anymore. So I think that there's room for people to do that, but I'm not sure how much value a record company really adds. If you go finance a video for an artist, yeah, sure, then you've really done something, but we can't do that with most of our artists. It's just not feasible. There aren't the outlets to show it, to make it pay for itself. Most artists don't want to have to worry about it. It's part of what it amounts to. First of all, they might not be able to raise enough money to make the record in the first place. If they did, geez, then you've got to go talk to a printer, and then you've got to go find a pressing plant that's willing to do it, and are they going to give you credit, or do you have to come up with even more money to pay up front? And then what do you do with the records? Most distributors, we were touching on yesterday, most distributors don't want to hear from every single artist that has a record. Tower Records, at some point about 5 or 6 years ago, found they had something like 800 people selling their records, and they decided to cut it down to 20. They didn't succeed, but they did make some radical cuts. They just basically forced people to come into a more limited number of distributors because they just didn't want to maintain that huge number of vendors that they have to pay every month and hear from and get statements from. You've got to open all those envelopes.
That's interesting, and they're so big. Did that force any kind of consolidation or even shutting down in the distribution world?
It was right at the time that there was a lot of move from regional distribution to national distribution. And they were right in line with it. Okay. Maybe at that point just a little bit. It was already happening, but I think that was just sort of like a big red flag to a lot of people saying, things are definitely going to be different.
Just to progress a tiny bit, I want to stay generally on the same topic, and maybe I'll have to look at this. I know at this point you put out, for instance, say the Country Cooking album, which is a young musician who wants a career. You'd also at this point done some licensing of older stuff, haven't you? You'd done
I don't know when we first did the first licensed album. It must have been quite a while. I'd have to look.
Beyond 73, 74?
Yeah,
definitely. I'm wondering, you did one that had Dewey Balfa on it, I know, but that was, and I thought that was early on.
Well, that was the one that we licensed was sometime in 78, maybe.
Okay, later than Ken was suggesting when we were talking about Cajun.
The first Cajun album that we put out did have Dewey on it, but that wasn't licensed. That was a deal we did. That came out in July 76.
Okay.
And the first Cajun album, actually, we put out in 74. It was D.L. Menard.
Right. Okay. He was singing with a band.
Right, the Louisiana Aces.
Yeah.
For about 2 years, we worked on that other set of two, the 6001 and 2, the Louisiana I don't know what it was called.
Ken had thought you'd done
Cajun music.
A licensed thing before the Menard.
No. No, because that was just a thing where Ralph Winsler let us have his tapes and put them out.
Okay. As
long as we paid the musicians. And we just contracted with each of the musicians.
The Menard, you said, was 74?
74, yeah. And that was the first one that we put out.
No, I take it even him. He was alive and around and performing, but he had to be, I imagine, somewhat different than a Wernick, say, in terms of his attitude toward marketing and his own career.
Yeah, he was a furniture manufacturer.
Yeah,
I guess we saw him at the Smithsonian Festival, maybe, and decided to make a record of him. Maybe Dick Spottswood had heard about him somehow, and I think Ken and Dick actually recorded him together in Louisiana. But
Yeah, Ken said he saw him at
Wolf Trap.
Wolf Trap, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, he was by no means making a big part of his career.
Right.
And it's one of those people that just maybe went to a couple festivals a year.
Yeah.
In the outside world, and probably had a weekend band that he played in. But his real job was in making furniture, chairs, and
so he was not, or at least not the type of person who was nudging you about
not at all
promotion.
Never has, I don't think. We should ask Ken who it was, but it was it might have been one of the guys out of country cooking. It's hard to imagine. I mean, I'm just looking down the list here. Certainly, Del McCoury was never that kind of an aggressive person in terms of trying to really push his own career. I don't know. It was definitely a few years into things. I don't see anybody for the first 4 years that, other than country cooking, that makes me think there was somebody out there that was urging us.
Okay, so what did you do? What did you...
When they said to
yeah, okay, this is said to you, and it's like, wow, what go on with your...
well, probably at the same time, as I mentioned, the Flying Fish had started up. So we saw some of the things that they were doing. They were more active, in just reaching out. I'm not talking so much about advertising, but they might have actually done a little bit of advertising too. But getting review copies out there more widely, developing a promotional mailing list of some sort. Even just beating the bushes and calling distributors more. It wasn't like there was a major... It wasn't like we added on a marketing person or anything like that. That wasn't happening for probably at least 15 or 16 years, I don't suppose, that we added somebody specifically in that area. So I think it was just sort of we stepped up the sales effort, stepped up the promotional effort. I don't think there was anything dramatic. But even though there was a time there for a couple of years when Flying Fish was perceived as a more active label than we were. We did come from behind, so to speak, and we caught up and surpassed them in an obvious enough way if you were looking at the whole spectrum of things. And Bruce kind of burned out relatively early in terms of wanting to slug it out in the sales environment, and because I think he too maybe liked putting out records more than he liked selling them. He came from an academic background in anthropology, and he was never especially good business person. Just when he ended up buying Flying Fish, it's kind of obvious. He was very casual about paying royalties and things like that. He didn't always collect all his bills either. I mean, it was just like somewhat chaotic systems over there.
Was there something antithetical to you about that, with your mission with that, or did you accept it? I mean, once you thought about it, is it simply that you hadn't thought about selling, or it somehow seemed crass or tainted?
The first album that I see that I can see that we really licensed was in April 1977. It was a Balfour Brothers album that we licensed from a company in France.
Okay.
And there may be one that I'm kind of missing here, but I don't see it. So I think it was a while before we got into licensing. So, okay, go back to what you...
Well, the question was, did you, I understand that you hadn't really thought about your role as salespeople or marketers, but once you thought about it, was it just like, did you say, well, that makes sense, I understand that, or did you have to wrestle with it? Did it seem somehow contrary to who you wanted to be?
Well, I think part of it seemed contrary because it was commerce and money making or something. But on the other hand, we were out there that first summer at festivals every weekend setting up a stand with a folding card table and selling records out of our thing, taking the money in. And naturally, we wanted to sell more in that environment. You didn't want to sit there and discourage customers. Right. This festival that we took in $2,000 was better than a festival that we took in $1,500 at.
You knew that early first year.
Yeah. And yeah, we took all the money. We took our own salaries too from these outside jobs, but the money that we got in there, and we plowed it back into the company. And there was no question, there was no debate about growth in the early stages. We just wanted to grow as fast as we could, but we didn't talk about it. It just seemed like, oh, here's another great band, we should record them too.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be great to do an album by her? Or what about that guy over there? Yeah, let's go do that. It was just an excitement about doing this kind of stuff. It wasn't like, there was no 5-year Harvard Business School plan.
Sure.
By any means. It was just enthusiasm and drive.
What do you remember? What are the early signs I use the word loosely. What are the early recordings that excited you the most? That I understand you may not consider yourself the music maven of the...
We talked about a few yesterday.
Yeah.
That Snuffy and Pappy record down in South Carolina where we were in a real recording studio and stuff, but that was pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Because those guys had been playing music for 33 years at that point. We called the album 33 Years of Picking and Plucking, I think. That's what they...
Did they produce themselves?
Well, more or less,
Yeah.
except they were in the studio and we were on the other side, so but we were just learning by doing it. The engineer we had to rely on for the mic placement and so forth, but it was all direct to 2-track and direct to stereo.
They just played.
They basically just played,
Yeah.
because they were easy. They had a minstrel guy that played with them on some stuff, so there was, I think, up to 4 musicians at a time, but the engineer handled all that kind of stuff. And we might say, oh, try that one again, or whatever, but we were not exactly intrusive in the process.
Yeah.
Some of the tapes, like the Fuzzy Mountain String Band out of North Carolina, they just made the tape and sent it to us on their own. That was a very good tape. Mud Acres, that first album that came out of Woodstock and stuff, they asked us, we'd like to get a group of friends together and do a record. So we said, well, it sounds great, but they did the whole thing.
Happy Traum, the Drive.
Happy and Artie, the two of them. And they put that one together completely. Don Stover is an album that we recorded in the studio around here.
He was playing.
He was a
Boston
band,
Living,
he was played in this area, but we went to the studio and we went out and did the recording there. That was in our 3rd year. It was one of those 19 albums we came out with in the 3rd year. We went down to record a guy named Fiddlin' Steve Ledford, who was a old-time fiddle player down south, and with a family heritage and stuff. That was kind of a nice, I don't know, they were all kind of exciting to us then. Some that came in from afar and some that we went and recorded. I liked going on the field trips. I mean, to go down to this guy's house and actually do the recording. I think we might have recorded it at his house. All these people lived way out in the country where there wasn't much noise going around anyhow. I remember one session I did fairly early on that all by myself in '74. We called the Smoky Valley Boys. She's not in yet. This afternoon sometime though. They recorded the album in these guys' living room. It was a full band, 5 people, I guess. I don't know how I did it. I mean, it's sort of now. I'd be so afraid to undertake that. But I just watched other people do it. I set up 2 mics. I made sure everything sounded right. But a thunderstorm. There was a thunderstorm the whole night. And so it's like, you try to get 3 numbers in between claps of thunder. And then, you get 2 minutes into the song, boom. Oh, no, we're going to start over again, And when we did the whole album somehow, that one evening during the thunderstorm, in between all this other activity, the power held up, so forth. But it was a little shaky experience. But it came out okay, I guess. So we had a guy came up, a guy named Mark Pivar, who'd been in Africa. And he came to us with some tapes from Alhaji Baikonte, the kora player, that we put out in June 1973. So that was, early on. That was our first real music album.
Did that give you any pause? I mean, did you just say it fits with the rest?
Well, he was enthusiastic. He'd spent a year living with him, and it was very different. And we hadn't put on the African records at that point. We had put out country blues guys from Georgia, from some other tapes that a collector had, and we started by that time also our so-called protest series. We had an album of the Chicago and the New Haven Women's Liberation rock bands and Negro songs of protest. There were some old recordings from the 30s. We had an Irish Rebel Songs album. And we put out all just things.
Where did you get that from? Where did you get
There
those
was
tunes?
guys that lived in the Boston area.
Oh, I see.
It was a group that played around here. And these are just basically all came from people that learned about us and approached us. Wouldn't this be a great idea for an album? And it was easy to talk us into a lot of things because they just seemed like interesting ideas for that Irish song. These guys were a bunch of guys that played at a local bar, and they knew a lot of these songs. I can't remember who talked us into that one, but I think it was a guy that owned the studio that we recorded it in, actually, that knew them somehow. Maybe they were drinking buddies or something. But I remember I did a lot of research into Irish Revolutionary history and so forth at the time. I spent a lot of time researching, writing the notes for the album about the history of Irish rebellion and stuff. That
were the songs traditional songs, or were they songs they were made
well,
up?
mostly they were traditional songs. Yeah, maybe one of them was a new song or something. But I know I got in touch with some local representatives of the IRA and so forth, and got some literature and this and that. And so it's an interesting process because we did try from the beginning to have good liner notes to present things. We were teachers and we were also missionaries in a sense here. So we had a message that we were trying to convey, whatever it might be.
What was it?
Well, it varied from album to album, I guess. In terms of the Irish Rebel songs, I mean, trying to explain what this music was, where it came from, what purpose it maybe served, and where if it was trying to get the British out of Ireland at the time too. So it had its own goal. You talk about Fiddler and Steve Ledford. I mean, the message there was he's an old timer that's been playing music since the 1930s maybe, or whenever he started, but it must have been around that time. And he knows a lot of old fiddle tunes, and here they are, but we wanted to tell about this tune. We had people that would know more about that could write intelligent notes about the tuning and, that this is different from this variation and so forth. It was all to try to convey something.
What did you want to convey with a revival, a pure revival, the country cooking, or I guess Joe Rouse, quasi?
Well, but I mean, if you look at those albums, each of them have song notes about, why did they wrote a lot of the songs, country cooking. More than half the songs, I think, were ones that they wrote.
Yeah.
But then they talked about writing. I was inspired to write this song because I, one day was sitting on a bench and this bird came by or something. I don't know. They just would talk a little bit about why they wrote that particular song, or that they would comment on the musicianship. In the second verse, we have both banjos going at the same time, that describing what they were doing.
Certainly by their second album, the music was changing. It was getting a little more far out, I'd say, by then. Did that cause you any pause at all? I mean, did you say we're veering away from tradition?
No, I think that
interpretation is right, but what they're doing with it is
Ken,
not right.
I think that Ken in particular liked that on the edge, cutting edge of the musicianship. I think Ken was very strong about that. So Andy Statman's mandolin and so forth. The further out he went, the more Ken would have liked it.
Did you debate it at all? Was it
No.
True. It didn't. Okay. You didn't feel that sense of traditionality, or we're screwing with the tradition.
No, not really. And we didn't get much feedback of that nature either.
Right.
There was, certainly there were some that we could pick up on,
Yeah.
but we were seeing ourselves as people that were trying to change things at the same time. We were trying to look at old tradition, but at the same time, the late 60s and early 70s was a big time of people thinking the world was going to be drastically different. And we were involved in that process too, for the political demonstrations and all that type of stuff. One of the reasons we had this active protest series going from early on is we wanted to try to help bring about some kind of change. But I don't know, we never, the first time I recall seriously having a debate was at the time of the first George Thorogood album. And that debate was whether or not we were straying too far. into a pop direction, or whether we were going to, by putting out this record, even though we thought it was a neat record, whether we were going to alienate our customer base by, they would say, that rather than selling out and so forth. That record came out in July 1977.
Did you make the record, or did George make the record for any?
No, we made it.
Okay, George, you saw George's act.
Yeah.
But I think you didn't see him until he came to you and said, I want you to record me, and then you went.
Well, the story is told on the back, on the notes of the first album. It was a bus driver that introduced us to him. He drove a Head Start school bus for kids around here, and he was a former alcoholic. He used to spend all his money on drink. Now every Friday when he got paid, he came over to our place and bought records. He spent all his money. I mean, better.
It's a healthier habit, right?
But he still, he was still addicted to something.
My wife would have
The so-called vinyl junkie. But yeah, I mean, he had a box over there where he couldn't afford, the records he couldn't afford this week. He would set them aside so they'd be waiting for him next week. He was our best single customer, So we'd have this box of John Forward's records, and then he'd come in next week and maybe something new had come out. And we'd sort of sort through the box and see what was new and buy that week's selections and stuff. But he was very enthusiastic about George because he'd seen him in the band play. He kept talking to us for a long time about his tapes that they sent up and this and that. And finally, in frustration, he booked a show himself. This bus driver put on a show, a benefit for the Head Start program. He called it. I don't know if they actually raised any money to speak of or not, but he put George into a VFW hall. It's just up the road here, just up this very road, and take a left of a couple blocks. And he said, okay, now I'm putting my money up to get you to see this guy. You can't let me down. And so I went over there, and like 2 songs into it, I called Ken on the phone in the place. I said, get over here quick. You got to see these guys. They're really nice guys too, as opposed to just that they make good music and stuff. So we ended up doing a record with them. And then we had to cut the whole record kind of over again because listening to the first test pressings, they didn't have a bass player at first. They just had 2 guitar players and a drummer on it. And, it just didn't sound full enough. And so we actually had them come in and had brought a bass player in. We ended up joining the band, and the other guitar player was leaving anyhow. It was just happening at the right time. But that was a little traumatic too. But we hadn't done that, it might not have worked very well.
Had Thurgood been promoting himself to labels at all?
He was trying. He had recorded a bunch of tapes in a regular studio, and he had a manager that had shopped them around. Some years later, MCA bought up those tapes and put them out. And we got involved in that non-legal mess on that subject. But he had sent them to Chris Strackwitz, turned them down. Different. I mean, you can understand why. Yeah. Although he did admit later that he regretted that.
Well, for financial reasons.
Yeah. Just like the country Joe and the Fish song that made him so much money or something. He probably didn't care about that song, but he was happy to have it underwrite some of his other projects. I don't, there have been some debates. There weren't so many debates in the early times, though. I mean, I suspect the African thing, we probably thought about it a little bit. But since one of our models was Folkways, it fits right in.
Well, a question that I had when you brought that up was, did you feel a need to satisfy yourself that you knew it was authentic stuff? I mean, how did you know that it wasn't African pop music?
I know.
Because I don't think I would know.
Right. Well, the guy talked the right way.
Cabaret tunes.
Well, when we could hear, it wasn't quite that.
Right, but you didn't.
But he showed us the slides, and he talked about his things. He was just convincing. I'm sure somebody could hoodwink us.
Yeah.
Even today, maybe.
Right.
And we used to joke about doing that to
Well,
Folkways.
and you could ask.
Yeah, when we used to joke about doing that, we were just going to make a tape. We would all go around and go, just, grunt and make these notes, and then we'd write up these academic sounding things about, these rituals and stuff. And
would have flowed.
if we'd done it halfway well, it could have been done.
Yes.
But we didn't quite get around to it. We're also thinking about counterfeiting albums too, like county records. So many people will call them country records. They didn't realize it said county. They thought it said country, because, you know, that. So, and they had this distinctive little logo where each letter was in a box reversed out of a little black rectangle. And so they thought, well, let's just make one up that says country instead of county, and hardly anybody will even know the difference. And we'll put this, you know, put something on there that starts off sounding right and then ends up being very weird or something. And just to goof around. It was that parody idea that I had from the humor magazine days and stuff. We never did it, but it was fun to talk about, though. It would have been fun with Folkway sound. I wish we had.
So, did you ever?
But I mean, to answer the questions further, you know, we did, a lot of this was word of mouth. A lot of the groups that we ended up dealing with, Riders in the Sky, was Charles Wolfe, as I recall, from Tennessee, Middle Tennessee State, calling us up and saying, I just saw this group, they're just really great, you guys have to sign it. It was enthusiasm of people who we respected as knowledgeable in the field. And we'd never heard of Mark Peavor that brought up these Biconti tapes, but he was convincing. I mean, he had, I think maybe he had was in a degree program and stuff, and we didn't have any reason to disbelieve him. That now, you know, sometimes we tend to check these a little more. If somebody comes in with a tape of a fiddle player, I'll send it to Mark Wilson, who's done so many albums for us, and ask his opinion on it. Happened recently, in the last 2 months, actually. In this case, he wrote back and said, boy, that's a really good record. He's a tough customer, too, so if he says it's a good record, then it really is. But, yeah, I mean, a lot of it was just, you know, we knew people like Archie and Joe Hickerson at the Library of Congress, and a lot of people like that. And I don't recall so often calling them up and saying, what do you think about this person or that person? But it might, just in all the discussions we'd have, names would come up. And so, you know, if somebody would mention a name, it was usually because they felt positive about it. And it didn't become a subject of concern. I guess we were self-conscious on the one hand, but I guess we were never worried about being duped back then, and even though we were thinking about doing it to other people.
You said yesterday that it never came up that anyone would ask you to record a rock band or something. It didn't arise until kind of Thorogood. Did you have much occasion to talk about what type of music you were putting out until the Thorogood situation presented itself, and then you said, well, this is not the kind of music we're talking about, you know, sort of in a backhanded way. You had to confront your mission in a sense.
I don't recall stuff coming up that was, it does now, but I don't recall then. If it did, it was probably just so quickly dismissed.
Yeah.
They would just say, oh, that's ridiculous. And that was the end of the conversation. I certainly know within, you know, a couple of years after Thorogood, we started getting all these tapes that, in Thorogood, we saw, partly we talked ourselves into it because we just wanted to, but we saw him as coming from a true tradition. And I think it's true. In terms of, he was roots rhythm and blues and roots of rock. He you know, doing a Chuck Berry tune or John Lee Hooker and so forth. Those people have roots. They're just not somebody that decided, I mean, I don't know what was in their minds, but when they started, maybe John Lee Hooker was doing something else and just says, I know how I can get some money, I'll make up these tunes and trick people into buying them or something. I don't know, you know.
Well, you know, he used to play acoustic guitar on the White Festival circuit and then go back to Detroit and play electric guitar bands, you know.
Yeah. No, I mean, they had their things. Chuck Berry was, I mean, his main appeal was to white audiences, not to black audiences throughout. Sure. And that's where the money was, and that was fine. I know I used to, when I was collecting singles back around 57, 58 or so, I had no idea these guys were white or black, hearing them on the radio. People didn't talk about stuff like that so much back then. And it was only the pop station around here started putting out a top 40 playlist once a week that you could pick up at the local record store. And up in the corner of it, they had a picture of maybe the #1 band. It was only as I saw some of these people there that I noticed, you know, that Lloyd Price was black, maybe. But it didn't cross my mind. That didn't seem to have any impact in me. I didn't make a sociological judgment of some kind. I just saw his picture there. Oh, that guy looks interesting. Or Little Richard with all his hair and stuff. Oh, that guy looks cool or something. But I didn't understand. I mean, this was even before the sitting movement began and so forth in 1960. So there was no civil rights movement going on. It was just these were different people, and it wasn't invested with a lot of stuff. And there were no black people around where I lived at that time, except my Sunday school teacher. I used to go play trains in his basement. He had this great train set up. I don't know, it just didn't strike me as, it wasn't an issue somehow. And somehow, I think that was involved here too. I mean, I heard a lot of different kinds of music on the radio back then. It was very open to a lot of, I mean, stuff now, you sort of wonder, how did this ever get to be a hit back then? But that music was, I mean, some of it was just, people were doing these weird things. I mean, like Monster Mash, you still hear that all the time. That was a national hit, and it has been twice since, I guess. But I mean, people would buy anything on the radio, it seems like. And people were, trying to make hits, certainly. I mean, people were doing what they thought would be a hit in some cases. I don't know. I imagine we probably got a couple of weird tapes that showed up with people that would say, let's do this or that. And we're probably very dismissive of some of them. Maybe not hurting the people's feelings, or maybe we did. I don't know. But, it has nothing to do with us. I can remember, but I'm guessing this is probably more like 78, 79. I can remember having phone conversations with people calling up, talking to us, and we say, well, we learned to say, what kind of music is it? Because occasionally, they'd say, I want to send you a tape. And we said, yeah, go ahead. And then we get this tape that was just like, as far as we were concerned, absurd. It was just somebody truly trying to be a commercial rock band or something, which we didn't really have any interest in at all. And I can remember having a couple of conversations with people, kind of putting them down, maybe being a little mean or something, but saying things like, what possessed you to send us this tape? Have you ever looked at our catalog to see the kind of music that we do? And I always remember erring on the other side instead of admitting to a thoroughbred or something. I'd say we try not to record people unless they're at least 80 years old, and they've learned their music before the advent of radio and the phonograph. And I don't understand why you would send us this record. What did you think it has to do with our company? And that was an easy way to cut off conversations kind of quickly, because you didn't have to get into a debate about, he's a really good rock guitarist or something like that.
But you were blown away by Thurgood. We're back to, you got Ken and Marion. I don't know, did you literally get them over there on that phone call? Or
Ken came over. I don't know where Marion was right then.
What did he think of it?
Yeah, he enjoyed it too. And it was the weirdest thing about it was that Mark Wilson, this guy who's, he's like super traditional. He really doesn't like revivalists playing old-time music. He plays himself, but he would never think of it. And he could make a good record, but he would never do it. And he just has this very strong traditional academic bias, partly because he wants to preserve the old music while it's still there to be preserved, and there's enough of it, you can't get it all. And so why waste your time with this, guy that's playing renditions of the old stuff when you can go find the real old stuff. And, he really liked documenting it from all these old ballad books and that type of stuff. But he was a big booster of George Thorogood, too, early on, and that helped convince us. He just liked the music, too.
What was he in 77? Was he a student? Was he
he was a graduate student at Harvard.
And where? At Harvard?
Harvard, yeah.
Okay. So, and Marion liked it too? She ended up liking it?
Yeah.
But she still...
And them. And I know, meeting them and seeing, they were just easy to talk to guys that were sincere about the music, and, I suppose they might drink a beer once in a while, but they certainly weren't into drugs and self-abuse of any kind. Yeah. And just very nice guys. And so that was important. At that point we had enough people that we'd worked with that maybe sometimes we'd gotten to the point that we realized that we wanted to work with people we wanted to work with, too, that there were some people that maybe made great music, but they weren't necessarily the easiest people to work with, and maybe we shouldn't end up. There's so many good things to do. George had this expression, he used to say something like, if it isn't fun, it isn't worth doing, and we kind of adopted that, too, to say, well, we might sell more records of person X, but we wouldn't enjoy the working relationship, and therefore, we should decline and work more with somebody that we thought we'd have a good relationship with. That has translated forward into, I mean, it's still a consideration, is what's the working relationship going to be like, and it's a very important factor in things. We still shy away from records if we think that it's more in terms of expectations now. It's in terms of managing the expectations or understanding the expectations of the person involved. If we think somebody is going to expect far more from us than we believe that we're going to accomplish, then we don't want to set ourselves up to disappoint them and make ourselves look like a failure in the process. That doesn't mean that we don't, have challenges and so forth and aren't willing to take some chances. But if you get the sense that somebody's being unrealistic in what they expect, then we know all we're going to get is grief later on. And so we either try to manage their expectations by talking to them and saying, talking to them about albums that they know and say, do you know how many copies this album sold or that album sold? And within some realm of discretion, because you don't like to. Some artists wouldn't like us saying their records only sold 3,000 copies or something.
Somebody's going to place themselves, though, in reference to someone they know.
Yeah. But we try to explain that, and we try to sell more copies, but, there's a lot of competition out there and this and that, and, we all have to work at this together. You're not the magic solution to things, you've got to be out there touring, and you've got to have some good luck, too.
So, what was George's, George obviously just wanted a record.
He wanted a record, yeah. He would have recorded for anybody. And in fact, it was kind of weird because we didn't make up our mind quite quickly enough, and he started recording for John Forward, the bus driver. He was going to put out his own record named after his dog. The record company was going to be named after his dog, and I went over to those sessions. And the first day of the session, I said, no, we have to do this. We just have to do it. And so we did, and John was happy because we were an established record company. But that first day's records also culminated in a lawsuit later on, too, because he'd done one day of taping, and then at some point, not that many years ago, maybe about 5 years ago, he decided he wanted to put those out because George wasn't being friendly to him anymore. If George had just called and invited him to shows, it probably would have been fine. But George, gotten isolated and didn't keep up the old stuff. And somebody talked him into, how you could get $100,000 probably if you put this record out and so forth. He said, well, why shouldn't I? He doesn't do me any favors these days. And so he announced he was going to do it, and then I guess George had to sue him. It ended up costing hundreds of thousands of dollars. John didn't have the money, but he had some lawyers that were willing to fight it out, on contingency and stuff. It went into a whole trial.
That didn't involve you.
Well, I ended up testifying at the trial.
You were a witness, but
yeah.
Really.
Well, and the weirdest part about it is that we, out of loyalty to George, we pretty much supported him in the trial, to tell the truth. And nothing but the truth, but I'm not sure we actually told the whole truth. We only answered the questions we were asked, and they didn't ask us some of the right questions they should have asked. But it might have been to our advantage to actually work out a deal with John and put out that record. George wasn't doing us any favors at that point either. He'd gone off. The deal that we had with him was finished. And, but we could have worked out a deal with John and said, well, we'll put this record out. The tapes were decent enough. They weren't great, but they were respectable if presented the right way as the first recording.
The archival.
That type of stuff, yeah. And so it's actually, but, we knew that George didn't want him out. And we'd been with George when neither of us wanted those MCA tapes to come out. And so, just,
So how did it, so somehow, I guess, we're getting to a point where you're seeing the need to become marketeers.
Well, we've been dragged into it progressively over the years. Kicking and screaming or whatever, but it's just something. I mean, now we have people that they do that. That's their primary thing, is to be the head of marketing and the assistant director of marketing and so forth. And they will sometimes convince us that we've got to spend, $10,000 to get in this program where your stuff will be on display at Borders Books, and we'll debate about it. I always try to take the approach that advertising never pays, and I always argue that point of view as a way of having somebody at least argue the point, and trying to get studies after the fact. Well, how well did that program do? What kind of returns did we get? How did it pay off afterwards? Because we do have limited resources, and there's a limit to what you can do. But yeah, we're decent in those areas. We're probably not the best company, but we're by no means the worst company.
Who was the first marketeer or other distributor you hired?
First person that we actually hired was Susan Piper. Well, actually, there was one person before her, Mike Z, I think.
Susan Piper, you hired distributor.
Yeah, I know. That's what I said. It was only in the last 5 to 10 years. It might have been about 8 years ago. That, if that we actually had a marketing person that we hired just for that reason. I mean, usually we work through the distributors, because the distributors were, we just figured they were trying to sell records.
Now, Brad is director of promotion.
Promotion,
right?
yeah.
Now, are those interchangeable terms?
No.
Promotions and marketing?
No, what he looks after is publicity and radio airplay.
Okay.
So he's looking at press and radio, basically.
All right.
And his strength is in
George
radio.
Hall, call the operator, please. George Hall, call the operator.
Essentially free publicity. He's getting it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Right. Getting reviews and
Right.
articles
Yeah.
about you.
And that's not somebody who's focusing on a sales plan.
Yeah. So basically, we figured the distributors were going to do the best job they could, because we knew as a distributor we were trying to sell records. But eventually we learned that maybe coordination among them would be a good thing. And even when it moved to national distribution and we had essentially one distributor, we realized that you have to be on the outside, or pulling and pushing at the same time, that same distributor, because they've got so many demands from other labels. When we used to distribute our own records, sometimes we were always our best distributor, but we had more things fall through the cracks, too, because we'd forget to tell ourselves. It's like we didn't think about, we'd send out faxes to all our other distributors announcing this new release, but we forgot to mail one to ourselves. And so some of the other people here didn't even know this release was coming out. It was weird. Sometimes we were like the last to know. But it's an obvious function. It just took us a long time to get around to doing that.
What were some of the early series you did? You talked about the political series. I want to take a look. Maybe.
Well, numerically, the first series was the Zero series. We picked 4-digit numbers because both our Hooli and Folkways had 4-digit numbers. And they seemed to mean something different than the numbers. So the Zero series was, and is, essentially contemporary recordings of bluegrass country and maybe some folk people. John McCutcheon, most of his albums are in there, for instance. The 1000 series is mostly reissues, mostly recordings of earlier music done maybe the 20s through the 50s and so forth. So it would be Blind Alfred Reed, Fiddlin' John Carson, Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers. That's where the Jimmy Rogers and the Carter Family records were put when we put those out more recently. Some calypso reissues. It could be all kinds of different music. But it's usually stuff that but not exclusively, it's usually stuff that we license from other companies that somebody else recorded in earlier times.
What was 1001?
That was Blind Alfred Reed, the fiddle player from West Virginia.
How old was the record?
They were done in the late 1920s. The 2000 series was essentially African American music from America. So it was usually blues, but not necessarily. It was kind of, we had a little debate about that because it seemed like this was racial segregation to,
series.
Yeah, to have all the black music in one series. And, well, what if you had a black musician that played, a banjo album or something? What would we do with that? And there weren't too many instances where something like that came up, but we sort of did some of one and some of the other was actually the answer.
What was 2001?
It was a double album. One side is by George Henry Bussey, The other side's by Jim Bunkley, and they were basically two Georgia acoustic guitar players.
Older stuff.
Yeah, a guy named George Mitchell that was down in Georgia had done a lot of field recording. Those were drawn from his field recordings. The 3000 series was essentially more contemporary folk. That was Mud Acres kicked off that series. And then John Miller, who was one of the guys from Country Cooking, did an album of solo guitar. It was meant to be a little more contemporary, not so traditional. And that's where we put the George Thorogood album. And that's where we put the Happy and Artie Charm, because they were, earlier days, they were a little more upscale or something, a little more commercially oriented.
Yeah.
Wouldn't seem that way today, but...
well, Happy told me at one point that Tom was talking to him that he, I think it was Ahmet Bergen, wanted him to do an electric band record. And they said, no, we can't do that. And he was rueful even 6 or 7 years ago. He was sorry that he didn't. So.
Right, who knows what they would have been.
Yeah.
The 4000 series was the protest series, social change albums, Come All You Coal Miners, the soundtrack to that Harlan County, USA film, and the Negro Songs of Protest I mentioned, Peggy Seeger and Ewan McCall, an album of, their kind of British revolutionary.
Was that a licensed thing, or did they record
that was like, the first one I think they recorded for us. Later on they licensed us an album or two. The 5000 series started with that By Conti album. That is an international music series, sort of the world music series. So stuff from other countries. Then the 6000 series started with the Cajun albums. That's essentially ethnic music in America, is what that is. The first three were Cajun albums. The fourth album was a Swedish-American fiddle player. The fifth album was Irish music in America. 5 and 6 were Irish music in America. The 7th was a Cajun album. 8th was Irish. The 9th was a Zydeco album. And so it was sort of music of ethnic subcultures within America.
Is that still maintained?
Yeah.
Zydeco still within 6000?
Yeah. The Zydeco stuff sometimes, though, is in the 2000 series as a black music thing. So, again, it's kind of weird.
And how do you make that decision, or does that make sense?
I don't know.
Okay.
Just do. Race tends to overrule other factors.
Okay.
By and large, most of the black music still goes in that series,
Yeah.
or on Bullseye Blues, where eventually we decided to start a separate blues label, which is another thing to get into. The 7000 series is Canadian music. The 8000 series is children's music. The 9000 series is what we call the New American Music Series. That was meant to be much more popular-oriented roots music, what you'd call Americana music today. It was a kind of a deliberate attempt to have a more commercial segment.
Sounds like, is that what Thorogood would go today?
Yeah, probably. Right. Some of the earlier bands there were, the Dynatones was the first one. I hardly ever heard of them anymore, but a woman named Christy Rose from New York, a Bottle Caps record, Brave Combo has always been in that series. Jonathan Richman. Look at the catalog.
We're getting way ahead. At some point, were you...
We never had a 10,000 series. We had an 11,000 series. It was all records of CDs that were 60 minutes or more of music, and that was it. Then the proliferation we've had since then hasn't been in terms of numerical series. It's been in terms of imprints, like Heartbeat as a reggae series, to keep that as a separate thing. That was partly done because there were outside owners in Heartbeat, at least at first. 2 other people who were involved, and we were all 20% owners. So that was partly set up just for that reason. But it made sense to have reggae as a separate series. And then eventually, with blues, I think what happened there is at a certain point, we just kind of realized that people still have a hard time trying to figure out what Rounder puts out. Some people still today think of Rounder as a bluegrass label, because that's all they know. They don't know that 10% of our records are bluegrass. Those are just ones they know about somehow. But we've envied labels like Alligator that were just pure blues all day long. And it was just easier for them to have identity. They were the preeminent blues label. And part of why they were able to do it is because all they did was think about blues. The only publications they ever had to talk to were blues publications. The only radio they ever had to talk to was blues radio. And you could get the talk down more, it's better focused and so forth. Still today, it might make sense. We only have really one person that works on Bullseye full time. It might make sense if we had 7 or 8 people and just set them up as an enclave. We do have 3 people that are just pure heartbeat people and just do reggae all the time. You know, if we were starting over again, we would set up a whole bunch of companies. We'd have a bluegrass label, and we'd have a folk label, and so forth. Because I think that identity makes a lot of sense.
Was there a point at which you wondered how everything could coexist? And I guess I'm really thinking...
We still do. I mean,
Okay.
it is that very same question still today. Whether I just said about Bullseye, I mean, I just raised this issue last week or the week before, one of the last 2 weeks, in a meeting. Somebody was saying, you know, about how some of those blues records don't sell as well as they should, and I said, well, maybe we should, you know, sure, Alligator sells more records, but they've got a whole bunch of people doing nothing but that. And I bet if we put 10 people just selling Bullseye blues all day long, that we'd sell more. We might not sell enough more to make it worthwhile, but we'd certainly sell more.
But I'm even going even back and maybe making a finer distinction between, say, I forget what series you said was the old American reissue series, the old
1,000.
1,000. Did you ever even think about whether or not that could work with, say, a Thorogood or even with a country cooking? Did you ever talk about whether the identity is getting blurred even back when you're just putting out country cooking and reissues of 1920s?
At some point, but I don't know when. Probably around the time of Thorogood, because that was significantly different. Even though we justified it as being, with the kind of calls we were getting were completely different kind of phone calls. People calling, a lot of people calling trying to buy the company.
Yeah.
And they would say, do you know how many records we have out? You have the one record, don't you? You know, no, we have, 150 records of old-time fiddle music. The same kind of thing to put off somebody, you know. We'll call you back, because we weren't interested in getting into a conversation about selling the company.
Yeah.
And it was just easier to cut the conversation short by throwing in this monkey wrench and say, people would have been happy to buy the company just to get the one guy.
Yeah.
They would have ended up ruining the company and shelving everything out.
Sure. But so I gather I'm getting a sense that you kind of not thought about it a lot. You just kept doing it.
Yeah.
Everything you liked. And,
I mean, it's not like we were just, I just don't recall much debate. We may have talked about these things, but there were relatively few times that we had any kind of serious disagreement about anything.
Right.
Among the 3 of us. It was just, there were so many things to do that inevitably one of us would be more enthusiastic than the other 2 about a given project. But my philosophy was always, you want to do that record, so do that one, and then the one that I get excited about, you'll let me do that one. There was enough to go around. It wasn't like we were going to put out one record a year and we had to bitterly fight out what record it was going to be.
When did you first hire somebody to do a promotion as opposed to one that they do something?
It was probably Brad, actually.
Which was when?
And that might have been 16 or 20 years ago, someplace in that stretch. You could ask him.
Yeah.
We could look it up. I just don't know when it was, but he's been here for a long time. Scott was one of the first, and he may be the oldest single person
He
here.
told me he believed he is.
Yeah.
He's the first rather employee
That
that's
stayed.
lasted at least, yeah.
Yeah. And he one of the first things he did was looking after things like advertising and promotion and stuff. He's done all kinds of stuff. He's done everything there is to be done, practically. From designing, creating an art department to producing records. I mean, he's an amazing guy.
But again, did you move into it without much trepidation or without...
When we hired Brad?
Yeah, when you hired Brad, when you started talking about the need to... I assume at some point you began to realize the need to work with stores and the need to work with radio and...
Yeah, it was, I think it flowed out of that whole time with George Thorogood pretty well, because we were getting deluged with calls, and we definitely grew in staff after, as time went on. We added people. I know by 84, it was actually fairly old by 84, but we had 24 people working here then. I remember that because we had to let 1/3 of them go. The company had grown after George Thorogood.
Yeah.
We just added more people, do this or that, to work this field or work that field, and then all of a sudden there was a contraction in the music business as a whole, which we suffered from too. And George was on EMI at that point, and so we weren't getting as many of the calls as we had been getting. We started losing money at a rather rapid pace, and so we had to cut back. There's only been a couple of years that we've actually lost money. There's been a lot of years that we didn't really make much money, $30,000 or so at the end of the year or whatever. But which may have been true for last year. I'm waiting to find out. We actually asked for volunteers if people would like to be laid off and go on unemployment. And we already had a list of who we wanted the most and who we didn't want the most. And the very 8 people that were at the bottom of our list were all the people that volunteered. It worked out perfectly. We didn't have to let anybody go. We didn't have to turn anybody out on the street. They were all people. Let's just think about going back to school again. That type of thing. And it worked out very nicely at that point. This last time when we lost money, we didn't let anybody go at all. We didn't even ask for volunteers because we looked at the situation and we believed that we understood what was going on, and it wasn't our fault or the fault of anybody that worked here. That we had a good staff, and it was just something we had to ride through. And that if we weakened ourselves in the process, that we might be doing ourselves a disservice. So we wanted to keep things going, and even though we were losing money, we could be losing more money if we, slacked off.
Then why don't you take a look at this and tell me about July '74 was an extremely active month here. You're a few years into this. What was going on there?
Let's see. Well, obviously, yeah, that was